So again, a very warm welcome to all of our participants. Welcome to our 10th panel of this truly inspiring e-conference. The topic now is going to be civil conflict and disorder in the modern Middle East. And my name is Olivia Glambitza, and I have the honor of chairing this fabulous panel. Before introducing our speakers, a few notes on housekeeping. I would like to ask all speakers to please mute themselves, and to switch off their camera during the individual presentations, except of course when you're presenting yourselves. In general, we had asked presenters to limit themselves to 15 minutes. However, because there's 3 of you, I would encourage you to take the liberty to finish within 20 minutes. Also, we are going to listen to all speakers first before moving on to a Q&A session at the end. And for the participants here, I would like to ask you to please introduce your questions in the Q&A section. And please try to keep your questions as clear and concise as possible. And also please state the name of the speaker that you're addressing with your question. And before moving on, a quick note for after this panel, we will also have a closing remark by Simon Mabon at 6:30 p.m. so that you're alert before leaving the session. You can stay online for that. Good, now let's present our speakers. I will start with our first speaker, which is going to be Maria-Louise Clausen. She's a postdoc at the Danish Institute for International Studies, and she's also a Sephardt Fellow. Maria-Louise is going to present her paper on the potential of nationalism in Iraq, caught between domestic repression and external cooptation. Our second speaker is going to be Christopher Phillips. He is reader in international relations at Queen Mary University of London, and he's also an associate fellow at Chatham House Middle East and North Africa program and the Imperial War Museum, and he's also a Sephardt Fellow. Chris is going to speak about when the wrong side wins, what history tells us about the prospect of a US-Syrian reconciliation after civil war. And concluding our panel will be Francesco Belcastro, lecturer and program leader of international relations at the College of Business Law and Social Sciences at the University of Derby. And he's also a fellow at the Center for Syrian Studies at the University of St. Andrews. Francesco is going to present today his paper titled The Odd One Out, the Algerian Civil War and External Involvement. Very well, so I'll hand over to you, Maria-Louise. Go ahead whenever you're ready, the floor is yours. And you need to unmute yourself, Maria-Louise. We can see your screen, but we can't hear you yet. You need to unmute yourself, please.
I know. I was just wanting to get the PowerPoint up and running. Well, so thank you very much for the organizers and our chair for inviting me to present at this event, and my co-panelists, and I look very much forward to their presentations. With that in mind, and although we were giving extra time, I will try to keep my comments short. So hopefully we can have time for discussion afterwards. So I will speak on the protests in Iraq that began in 2019 and the current political situation. As already mentioned, the talk is based on a paper in a recent POMED/CEPEP publication on sectarianism and international relations called The Potential of Nationalism in Iraq, caught between domestic repression and external cooptation. So since October 2019, Iraq has experienced prolonged protests that focus on the limited capacity of the Iraqi state to deliver basic services, unemployment, and rampant corruption. The 2019-2020 protests have been larger, more widespread, and of longer duration than previously. And most importantly, the protesters has call for an end to the ethnic and sectarian quota system that has defined Iraqi politics since 2003. So they reject the sectarian division of Iraqis into Sunnis and Shias and instead couch their protest in the language and symbols of Iraqi state-based nationalism. And the fact that the political elite responded to these largely peaceful protests with violence has then further deepened the crisis of legitimacy in Iraq. The protests have now been decimated, and obviously Corona has played a role, but more importantly, I think the harsh reaction by security forces and the limited outcome after more than 8 months of protest have led to failing numbers of protesters. This does not mean that the political economic causes of the protest have been solved. This presentation will highlight a few key internal factors and the growing rift between the US and Iran as this has impacted Iraq. This also underscores how internal, regional, and international dynamics often interact. In this POMEP-CEPAT publication, I argue that the American targeted killing of Iranian General Soleimani underscores the dilemma of how to reconcile a system of formerly like units, to speak the language of IR, with the role of great powers as upholders of international order. The United States justified the killing as a response to an escalating series of attacks by Iran on US forces and interests in the Middle East, and thus arguing that it was legally permissible under the authorization for use of military force against Iraq. So although targeted killings have become a permanent, or more or less permanent feature of American foreign policy, for example, in places such as Yemen, the assassination of Soleimani was quite unique in the sense that he was a high-ranking official of a recognized state, and it was done on the territory of another sovereign state, without asking the permission of Iraq or notifying the Iraqi state beforehand. The US has designated Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a foreign terrorist organization in April 2019, which is also kind of extraordinary because it is the first time that the US has designated an arm of another government as a foreign terrorist organization. It's also worth underscoring here that the attack also killed Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, founder of Kataib Hezbollah and de facto leader of the Popular Mobilization Forces, this umbrella organization of militias, whereof some of the more important ones are supported by Iran. So you could argue that where Soleimani was the face of Iran's network of militias operating abroad, Muhandis embodied the Iraqi state's inability to assert a monopoly of legitimate use of violence within Iraq. In this sense, both the US decision to carry out the attack on Iraqi soil and the actors targeted in the attack underscores how the Iraqi state does not hold a monopoly of violence within its own borders. The killings of Soleimani and Muhandis had immediate implications for domestic Iraqi politics, not least the trajectory of the protest. So again, it can be read as an example of how issues of conflict and order among states are inseparable from issues of conflict and order within states. Especially because these Iranian-backed actors in Iraq who had been unable to tame the independent protesters, they took this opportunity presented by the US killing of Soleimani and tried to reassert their control over the protests. And it was also in this light that the Iraqi parliament narrowly passed a non-binding resolution urging the government of Iraq to end all foreign troop presence in the country, which was specifically targeting the presence of US troops. So let me just briefly return to the protests. As already mentioned, the main focus were on corruption of the ruling elite, the lack of services, government mismanagement, and unemployment. The Iraqis are demanding an end to the current sectarian and ethnic-based political system that was established after the US invasion in 2003. So there has been reoccurring protests in Iraq for years. So perhaps what was most surprising was exactly this element, that they were also criticizing Iranian involvement in Iraqi politics and the Iranian role in Iraq's current troubles. For example, in November 2019, protesters burned down the Iranian consulate in Najaf and offices belonging to Hasta al-Sha'bi, the Popular Mobilization Forces. And also because groups that have been associated with the Hasta al-Sha'bi has been a key part of this very harsh reaction by the Iraqi security forces that has killed more than 500 protesters and injured tens of thousands of protesters. They have lost a lot of legitimacy. They've not had the same ability as previously to claim that they were outside of the Iraqi state security apparatus. So what has happened since is, of course, that even though, as I mentioned, these protests have dwindled, they have not dwindled because the protesters have been able to achieve their aims. But one thing that they did achieve was that the previous prime minister resigned, and after several tries, we now have a new prime minister, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, who was confirmed almost 6 months or about 6 months after Abdul Mahdi resigned in late 2019. He has, of course, promised to instigate reforms, but again, there are doubts about how much he can do, especially also because, of course, now he is also challenged by the effects of Corona and declining oil prices, which has hit the Iraqi economy very hard. One of the things, for example, is that there is a very strong demand and a very understandable demand for job creation, for example, by these young protesters. And in many cases, this translates into a demand that the public sector should hire more people. But we also know that the Iraqi public sector is already bloated and inefficient, which of course can in part be explained by corruption, nepotism, and just general inefficiency. Including the presence of ghost employees. And these things should, of course, be targeted to make the public sector more efficient. But then at the same time, it's also not realistic that the Iraqi state and the current issues with unemployment can be solved as they has been previously by just expanding the public payroll. So again, this just illustrates that some of these dilemmas that are facing the current prime minister are beyond perhaps the reach of one single person. And then in addition to these internal issues, as said, they closely interlink with regional and international dynamics, especially here, of course, the growing tensions between Iran and US. And of course, this US assassination of Soleimani increased the fear that Iraq would become a theater for this increased animosity between the US and Iran. As I argued in the CEPAT piece in more detail, that is also one of the ways that where the protesters, they sought to present an alternative by focusing on nationalism as a different path than this sectarian, ineffective, old political system that has dominated Iraq for decades. In this sense, the protests were simultaneously a rejection of sectarianism, the domestic political system, and external interference in Iraqi domestic politics. Whether this interference was done by the US or Iran or other actors, seen to be used by the elite to control the Iraqi people or weaken and divide the Iraqi people. In this sense, this appeal to nationalism becomes double-edged. It's both used to challenge the internal Iraqi elite, but then at the same time, it's also used to call for respect for Iraqi sovereignty. It's both a rejection of domestic politicians who have sought external patronage to bolster their internal domestic power, but also a direct rebuff to external actors who have exploited the weakness of the Iraqi state to increase their influence over Iraqi politics. The protesters had linked this call for a civil state to the need for external actors to respect the sovereignty of the Iraqi state. The Iraqi state obviously is very dependent on external support, but this system is highly asymmetric. The rents that Iraqi elite actors have accrued from their foreign patrons have been used to sustain the regime and then further alienate the Iraqi political elite from the Iraqi population. So again, I think it's interesting here that this rejection of territorial nationalism was once linked to colonialism and the interference of external actors, but it's now used to further an agenda that seeks to safeguard Iraqi society against external interference. And of course, this is a dynamic process that keeps evolving, and we're now seeing that the US and Iraq are engaged, just had their first strategic dialogue to address the sort of fate of the US military coalition in Iraq in June. And there is agreement on reducing the number of US troops in Iraq over the coming months. So it will be quite interesting to see how that plays out and how that affects other actors in Iraq. For example, the NATO that has been kind of called upon to take on a bigger role. At the same time, tensions have been high in Iraq, with some arguing that Iraq is turning away from Iran. And for example, there's been this recent arrest of a number of members from Kataib Hezbollah, one of these key members of the Hashd al-Shaabi supported by Iran, who had their leader killed in the same attack that killed Soleimani. But I think it's important to remember that Iran remains the key actor in Iraq. And I think at this point, it's too early to see if this attempt by Kadhimi is actually an attempt to weaken a real effort to weaken the influence of Iranian-backed militias, or if it was more of a signal to the US in the context of this strategic dialogue that is ongoing. Where it would make sense also if the Iraqi leadership wants to signal that they are prepared to counter Iranian-backed militias, perhaps even to avoid that the US does something to escalate the situation by itself. Just in terms of finishing, obviously Iraq has been hit hard by declining oil prices and now also the coronavirus. And the Iraqi public sector is struggling, which has a severe impact because, as already mentioned, so many livelihoods depend on it. This means that the current and potential future governments need to find ways to address basic demands, including job creation and improvement in public services. We are seeing the health sector in Iraq struggling to meet the demands being put on it by the coronavirus, as in many other places. This is challenging in a context where both internal and external actors will, in each their way, try to influence and impact the potential for reform. And we see that there's a lot of we see that the political actors are, of course, seeking to maintain status quo that has benefited them for years. And I think here the process of gaining approval for the new prime minister illustrates this process quite well. He was the third candidate when he was finally approved, where the dilemma is that somehow there's a call for someone to come in from outside the political system who is not tainted by the existing political system. But then it's almost impossible to get to the position where you could become a prime minister and actually change things if you are not part of the political system. So the protesters and many Iraqis want someone from outside the system, but someone from outside the system will struggle to get anything done. And then regardless of who is or the prime minister or who holds powers, there are currently so many factors influencing events in Iraq that anybody would struggle to get anything done. So I think I will stop at this very positive note and give the word to our chair.
Thank you so much, Maria-Louise. Always good to end on a positive note. Fantastic. So just for the ones who have joined us a little bit late, we are going to hear now from Christopher Phillips. He's going to speak about when the wrong side wins, what history tells us about the prospect of a US-Syrian reconciliation after civil war. And please, for everyone who would like to ask a question, do so and put them into the question and answer section. And please try to be as short and concise as possible with your questions and name the speaker you're addressing. Thank you so much. And Chris, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Olivia. I will attempt to share my screen, see how we do. It's not always great, but let's see. You all got that? Let's.
Yes, it looks very good.
Yeah, I know. Look at the picture that I found on Google Images this morning. Yes. So, firstly, thank you, Maria-Louise. That was a really fascinating paper. My paper plays on a few of those themes a little bit, especially given I'm dealing a little bit with Iraq. But that said, this paper is a bit of a departure, even for me. It's doing something I haven't really done in my own work before, which is using a kind of long view historical comparative approach. I'm actually going back to my roots. I was originally a historian and then switched into international relations. But what I really wanted to do with this paper was sort of go back to that and use historical examples to perhaps draw on, sort of use some of the historical context and examples to tell us something about what might be happening in the future with regard to US-Syrian relations. So I gave the title of this talk, "When the Wrong Side Wins: What History Tells Us About the Prospect of US-Syrian Reconciliation After Civil War." And as I hope you can see from here, what I'm really interested in is the future of Syrian US relations. I'm not going to sort of look, sort of project in the future and say this definitely will happen or anything like that. That's not what political scientists do. But I want to maybe look at what has happened in similar situations in the past to give us an indication of what might possibly happen moving forward. The puzzle as such is that where we are today in Syria-US relations is, I suppose, relatively unique in that you have a situation where, as I put in the title, the wrong side has won a civil war from the perspective of the United States. The United States backed the anti-Assad opposition, and whilst we can debate about whether or not Bashar al-Assad has won Syria's civil war, it is still ongoing. Large parts of the country are still unconquered. But given that the war was primarily about Assad's toppling and whether or not Assad would rule in Damascus and elsewhere, and indeed the United States under first Obama and then later Trump did declare as their goal, their intention to see Assad defeated. They backed the opposition forces financially and militarily. Those forces failed to topple Bashar al-Assad. So in that sense, the wrong side has won this war from a United States perspective. And that got me thinking about when this has happened before. When has the United States actively sought to oppose a ruling regime, when it's backed another side in a civil war, in a civil conflict, but that has not gone to plan? How long has it taken for the United States to re-engage with that quote-unquote wrong side, if indeed they ever have done. And as I'll come to talk about, there are many instances where the US has opted not to engage and actually has continued to isolate a victorious regime, whether through economic sanctions or blockades or diplomatic sanctions and so on, as a means to punish the victorious side that it wasn't happy about, sometimes to try to change its internal behavior, improve things like human rights governance and so on. And indeed, we begin to hear that kind of language already about Syria. The recent Caesar sanctions that have just been put on this year have a long list of reasons behind them, but a lot of them are aimed, at least in theory, at punishing Assad for his alleged war crimes and trying to incentivize improved behavior in terms of human rights governance and holding war criminals to justice. So we are seeing this pattern in place in Syria, and whilst this paper doesn't talk a great deal actually about Syria at the moment, it will do in the future. It's kind of a work in progress at the moment, and what I want to talk about today is what I've found has happened in the past, and whether or not we can draw any conclusions that might be useful for the Syria case. I'm particularly interested, and this is where my IR-ness kicks in, I am particularly interested in whether or not the systemic change that we've been talking about this entire conference, the sort of the shift from global unipolarity to more multipolarity, which is still in the process of evolving, but is certainly we've moved away from that unipolar moment that occurred in the 1990s and 2000s. And I'm especially interested in whether or not that will make reconciliation more or less likely. So I'm really interested in the global system and the international system as a variable in affecting whether or not the United States chooses to engage. I've put another, just on my slide there, I have put another example, another question that I'm interested in, which I'm not going to dwell on too much in this paper, which is whether or not engaging with the wrong side makes regime change or an improvement of conditions more or less likely. The reason I'm not really engaging with that is that I don't think I've got the data yet to come down strongly one side or the other, but I am just curious as a topic, as a subject matter there, because that is often what is a declared goal of sanctions. And so I'm just kind of interested in that general point, yeah, but is this actually the case? Are you more likely to either bring about regime change or improve conditions in a pariah regime if you engage or if you isolate? I will talk about my cases in a moment, but I just wanted to sort of highlight to people my entry point into this topic, and it was very much a comparison between. Basically, what I did was I was really interested in when has this happened before? When has a side that the United States did not want to win a conflict won, and what did the US do in terms of engagement and sanctions? And you kind of have an interesting kind of good and bad model that I immediately thought of when I started looking at this. The good model, although again a lot of this is open to debate, is what happened with Spain after Franco won the Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s. Now the US didn't actively support Spain, the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War. It was more neutral, but the administrations in the 1940s, especially Truman, were quite hostile to Franco's regime. So there was a position of hostility coming from the White House. And ultimately, for different reasons, which I'll discuss, the White House opted to engage with Spain. And whilst the rule of Franco was brutal, there is an argument that some people have made. I'm not necessarily one of those people, but there is an argument whereby engagement with this regime over time contributed to an improvement in domestic conditions in terms of human rights. Certainly conditions were at their worst in the 1940s. They got better in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And some people would argue that this was a long-term process that contributed to Spain's ultimate democratization after Franco died, and engaged, reabsorption within the Western Alliance, the European Union and NATO and so on. The flip side of that is what happened to Saddam's Iraq after 1991, the civil war that took place. It was a very brief civil war. Saddam won it very quickly in 1991 against the Shia uprising in the south, and to a lesser extent, in terms of Saddam's victory, that is, against the Kurds in the north. What we saw as a consequence of that was a very, very strict sanctions regime led by the United States, but endorsed by the United Nations, which not only didn't improve conditions in Iraq, that contributed to considerable poverty, but it actually embedded the regime of Saddam Hussein even more. As we know, the US chose not to re-engage Saddam, ultimately instead opting to topple him in a military invasion in 2003. But we see, again, a contrasting example of when the wrong side wins. So I won't dwell too much on my kind of, the sort of overall contribution. I am looking at sort of contributing to kind of the general literature on sanctions and engagement and disengagement, not really about whether or not sanctions work or not. I think that actually in the academic literature that has largely been settled amongst academics, not amongst policymakers. Policymakers are still huge fans of sanctions, but with the exception of Dresner, the vast majority of scholars on sanctions conclude that they don't really achieve their foreign policy goals. They largely tend to embed pariah regimes. But I do sort of draw on some of these debates, almost just to point out that there isn't really much of a debate there. And what I want to sort of add to sort of that literature isn't really to wade into whether or not sanctions work or not, but look more about when is it that states opt to end sanctions when they haven't worked? When is it when they actually say, okay, fine, this isn't working, we need to look at something else, and consider engagement? And I'm particularly interested in what the factors are that bring about that option to engage. And as I said before, I'm interested in the role that the international system might play in pushing and pulling the United States one direction or another on those decisions. So what I did was to sort of have a look at this, and I kind of went down into a bit of a wormhole, into a bit of a rabbit hole, in trying to find different cases to compare with today's Syria case. And actually what I discovered was that there aren't that many comparable cases to look at. There actually are very few examples of all the civil wars that have occurred. And again, we can debate definitions of civil war, and we can debate definitions of intervention as well. But broadly speaking, of the many civil wars that have taken place since the end of the Second World War, roughly 70, but again, we can, depending on your definition, it could be many more, it could be far fewer. But actually, in most of those cases, the US actually wasn't involved. And when it was involved and actively supported combatants one way or the other in a civil war, most often those combatants ultimately won. And there's only a limited number, I count 8, but again, it depends what we count as backing, of instances where the US supports the losing side. And so looking for case studies when comparable to what's happened in Syria, there aren't that many. And indeed, when I come to sort of turn this into an article, I might even get rid of the Spain example, because in many ways it's not a great example, because the US didn't actively support the Republican side in the way that it supported militarily the opposition in Syria, or politically other groups in other conflicts. So maybe that's not even a great case. I'll stick with it for now, but I do recognize its limitation. And ultimately what I decided to do was I chose 4 cases, Spain, Cuba, Vietnam, and Iraq, to look at, what happens when the US, has backed the losing side, and whether and how and when and if they choose to re-engage with the winning side that they didn't want to win. And I chose those case studies, as well as being very interesting, because they represent 2 examples of different international contexts. Spain and Cuba are very much the outcomes in terms of the decisions to engage or disengage, very much a product of the Cold War, the bipolar political system. So again, my interest in the role of the international system comes out there. Vietnam and Iraq, even though Vietnam, the blockade of Vietnam begins after the fall of Saigon in 1975, the decision to loosen the blockade, which comes in 1994-95, is very much a product of the unipolar moment. And indeed, the Iraq sanctions regime that I described earlier is also a product of the unipolar moment. So I'm quite interested in comparing those two cases as to why, you know, on the one hand, Iraq is isolated, on the other hand, Vietnam is engaged. And when I looked at these cases, and I'll briefly go through a very quick sort of summary, we don't have time to really go into the detail. I found that there is, you know, you could look at various different explanations as to why this occurs. And it's not strictly, you know, I'm not trying to make this too much about IR theory, although it is interesting how many of the themes of certain IR theories do come up when looking at those variables. So one variable is the international context, and especially the international system, whether or not a bipolar, a unipolar, or indeed today a multipolar international system pushes the US decision makers in one direction or another. How important is that? Which very much, you know, it comes from a sort of a systemic realist approach to IR, I suppose. Then the other sort of question or variable is the role of the states themselves, the sort of the isolated state. Do they want to engage with the United States? You know, how important is a confrontation with the US to the regime's survival, to their identity, to their ideology, and so on? How much they want to engage or not? How much did, and again, that overlaps a little bit, I suppose, with a more constructivist approach, perhaps to IR theory. How important was it that the US was involved in this civil war? How much did they actually involve? You know, the Vietnam War, for example, obviously the US sent huge numbers of troops over, which is far fewer, say, than, for example, you know, in the Cuba civil war and so on. How important is that kind of like historical experience of the US? And then finally, what about domestic pressure? Is there someone lobbying or pushing the US to take one stance or another? These are the kind of the four factors that I really sort of focused on. So here are very loosely my outcomes, so my provisional findings, looking at these four cases. And I won't go into them into too much depth because I've got a very limited amount of time. I've only got a few minutes left, but I just want to sort of like point out a few things. As you can see, you know, the two cases when the US chose to engage were Spain and Vietnam, when they opted to drop a boycott and re-engage economically and to an extent politically. The ones they did not were Cuba and Iraq. And when we look at sort of like the factors that are involved, you have, you know, in the Spain and Cuba case, both in the bipolar systems, the bipolar dynamics, the bipolar system pulls these cases into opposite directions. Spain is arguably engaged because it is seen as a potential ally against the Soviet Union in this sort of like world of the bipolar world, fighting over different allies. You know, Spain is engaged quite strongly, you know, used as a military base by the United States from 1953 onwards. Cuba, on the other hand, as an ally of the Soviet Union, is excluded for the same reasons, but in reverse. So actually, the bipolar in the nature of the global political context is really sort of pushing them in opposite directions. The Vietnam-Iraq comparison is quite interesting as well. You know, there's an argument to say that Iraq is excluded because the US can do so. It can sort of rally an international coalition against, against Saddam's Iraq, ultimately getting the UN to come on board to a sanctions regime. And yet at the same time, you know, in its mold, especially under Bill Clinton, of kind of, you know, opening up the world and kind of like moving beyond the Cold War. That is very much a driver in dropping the embargo against Vietnam and engaging Vietnam, you know, in 1994-95, and ultimately becoming quite a considerable trade partner. If we look at the other factors, I mean, I will skip to sort of my bigger conclusion, because as you can see, there's a very sketchy role played by either leadership desire or the US involvement in the Civil War. Even when the US has been heavily involved in Vietnam, for example, that doesn't seem to stop the US from re-engaging. So that doesn't seem to be sort of a strong factor. And likewise, the intention from the foreign state itself is quite variable. But one thing I do really want to point out is the role played by domestic pressure, because that does seem to play a considerable role in that there is strong domestic pressure in each case to either isolate or not isolate. So in Spain, you have sort of like cold warriors within the Truman administration really pushing President Truman, you've got to get Franco on board. Cuba, the reverse, you have a strong Cuban domestic lobby throughout the Cold War, really urging the US to continue with the blockade. Vietnam, it's funny, you get the reverse. You actually get veterans of the Vietnam War, the US veterans, really pushing engagement. It's no coincidence that it's John McCain and John Kerry, who are both senators at the time, who are leading the call within the US government to re-engage Vietnam and drop the 1975 embargo. And then finally, as Stephen Walton and John Mearsheimer have written quite a lot, actually the Israel lobby are pushing really quite hard to maintain the sanctions on Saddam in Iraq. So just moving forward to sort of some possible lessons, and I'm aware I'm out of time. If you look at the comparison to Syria, what I would suggest is that, at least provisionally, the most significant factors are into the international system and domestic pressure, but kind of nudging me towards a more kind of neoclassical realist explanation. It does seem that domestic pressure is probably the most powerful factor, or at least in conjunction with the international system. With that in mind, given the presence of quite a strong pro-sanctions lobby within the US, either pro-Israeli or more actually these days anti-Iranian, it would take a really significant shift in the international context for the US to overcome that domestic pressure. Now, in the previous examples, there wasn't really sort of like domestic pressure in the Vietnam and Spain case to keep going with the sanctions, to keep going with the embargoes, which meant that the change of the international context, the international system, allowed to open that position up. I wonder if there had been, whether that would have been the case. So I suppose, I'm kind of reaching the conclusion, and again, it is very provisional, but it does seem that, the presence of that strong domestic lobby mean that you need a really significant shift in international context, which, even though the multipolar system is new and it's therefore a bit of an unknown quantity, and therefore perhaps the US might be less powerful, you still need a real significant shift to nudge that domestic lobby away from its current course of action, and it's difficult to see that happening anytime soon. So whilst I haven't really talked about sort of the role of conditions, I think that's sort of perhaps the written paper when it comes out. I think I'll wrap things up there, but by concluding that these very provisional conclusions looking at the historical case is that the domestic lobby is really quite a significant factor, to the point that it doesn't overcome the international system and the international context, but it does play a really considerable role. And given that it's present in the Syria case, I think that the chances of any reconciliation between the US and Syria after the wrong side has won the Syrian civil war, quote unquote, is still going to be a long way away yet. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was super intriguing. Very, very interesting stuff there. And now I would like to invite Francesco up on the floor. Francesco Belcastro is going to present The Odd One Out, the Algerian Civil War and External Involvement.
All right. Hello everybody. Thank you very much, Olivia. So with your permission, since my one is the last presentation in the last panel, I'd like to sway a bit from my topic for just a second and say two things. First of all, massive thank you to, so I put my organizer cap on. Massive thank you to my co-organizer, Chris, who is on the panel with me, Chris Phillips, Jasmine Ghani, Eddie Wasnage, and Simon Maben. And most of all, a massive thank you to you, Olivia, to Yada Rifai, and to Elias Ghazal, which we don't see often because he's our technology guy. But these three have been fundamental and running the conference. Without the three of you guys, we wouldn't be here. This is one thing. The second thing I wanted to say is that you said it, Olivia, but I want to say it again. Just after this panel, we're going to have final closing remarks by Dr. Simon Maben at 6:30, and we've got over 30 people in the room now. So it'd be great if you could join us at 6:30 for Simon's remarks. I think it's going to be a very I'm very, very proud of what we have done. So please, let's celebrate together at 6:30 with Simon's closing remarks. Having said that, I'm gonna move on to my paper. Share screen. Okay, can you see it? Okay.
Yes, that looks fantastic.
I don't know. I've seen
Great.
some.
Just make it a bit bigger, Francesco.
I've seen some incredible stuff in terms of technology in this couple of days. So, you know. Okay, so the title of the presentation is Algeria, the odd one out. And the reason why I decided to write this particular paper, let me put the timer on so I actually know how much. Or Olivia, you will just jump in, right, if I take too much time. So I don't need to put the timer.
Absolutely, but feel free to take up to 20.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay, so I've been interested for quite a while in the topic of external involvement in civil wars. I sort of jumped in and out of this topic for a while. And I wrote a paper a couple of years ago, which was a comparative analysis of the Algerian and Syrian cases. I was looking at external involvement in those two cases and try to understand sort of the discrepancy in levels of external involvement as well as in different dynamics, if you want. Now, as I researched this topic, I became more and more interested on the sort of intersection between domestic and external conflict. Questions such as why do some civil wars see more external involvement or others less, but also different dynamics of external involvement. But particularly looking at the Syrian case, which is where I started from, if you want, I kind of struggled in this idea of how you reconcile, both conceptually and more in practical terms as a researcher, this tension between what happens on the ground, in the case of Syria, that sort of domestic protest, and then this kind of regional international dimension, which becomes more and more prevalent in the case of Syria. Now, obviously, I'm lucky because Chris presented just before me, and his book, The Battle for Syria, does an excellent job of explaining this tension, even while he focuses more on the external dimension. This paper, though, does a slightly different thing from what I did previously, in that it focuses specifically on one case. And this case is the Algerian Civil War. The reason why I decided to focus on this is because looking at different cases of civil wars that took place in the Middle East and North Africa, I focused specifically on sort of after World War II. I didn't go so far to civil wars before. All of them, except perhaps one or two, seem to have experienced very high level of external involvement by both regional and international actors, regional in some cases, international in some others, both in some cases. So much then the level of external involvement in many of these conflicts turned into the civil wars into something else. And again, I know there is quite a lot of debate on proxy wars or what you want to define them. Conflicts such as Syria also witnessed the involvement of high numbers of foreign fighters or mercenaries or non-state actors of different sorts. The Algerian Civil War, however, seemed to represent an exception. Involvement by external states was limited and the number of foreign fighters were very low. Now, for the purpose of, I should have said this before, I'm going to say it now. For the purpose of this paper and concerns with time, I won't go too much into the definition of what I mean by external involvement. I'm just going to say that I'm looking at both direct and indirect intervention. And the way I conceptualize that is sort of on a scale from very high level of involvement, you would have like direct intervention. And then on the other hand, you would have indirect support, economic help to one or more of the fighting factions. And in terms of civil war, what I define as a civil war, I use Statis Khalifa's definition in the logic of violence, because I find that particularly useful because it does not provide a quantitative number of how many deaths you need to have for it to come to the civil war. And I find that quite useful because I find the sort of quantitative aspect of that quite problematic, because it can change quite a lot according to context. So I use Khalifa's definition, and I think it's a good starting point there. If you have any question on that, I'm happy to discuss that in Q&A. Okay, so this paper, if I ever write it, would have this particular research question: why is the Algerian civil war seen a relatively low level of external involvement, both by state and non-state actors? And I like to emphasize this idea of state and non-state state actors, because it seems to me that it's quite the interaction between the two set of actors. It's quite central in many ways. Okay. Now, why do I say that Algeria is very puzzling? Okay, there is, according to most scholars, there is a low level of external involvement as I defined, but sorry. What I find very interesting is that you have in Algeria a lot of aspects, a lot of factors that in the case, the literature indicates that should lead to external involvement. So, for example, it's an important state in terms of its resources, is an important actor who was part of the non-aligned movement, has historical relations with Arab progressive republics, and all of these aspects, presence of resources, alliances, are often indicated as factors that would lead to external involvement. And particularly, I find puzzling the lack of involvement of non-state actors. According to most reports, there was a very low number of foreign fighters that joined the Algerian civil war, and that's particularly puzzling because Algerian Afghans, so Algerians that went to fight in Afghanistan, in many cases had a very prevalent role in Afghanistan. They got in contact with networks that we will associate with sort of international jihad, if you want, including the what was to become Al-Qaeda leadership. However, once they went back to Algeria and they got involved in the civil war, they were unable or unwilling to use these networks to bring fighters to fight in Algeria. And I think probably the best example for these non-state actors dimension I could think of is Abu Musab al-Suri, also Abu Musab Set Mariam, who many of you would remember because he was involved or accused of being involved in the Madrid bombing attacks in Spain. But I think it's very interesting because, well, obviously, as his name suggests, he was Syrian, but he was a very close in the early 90s to bin Laden and his inner circle, and also had very good links to Algerian fighters that he had developed during the Afghani civil war, Afghani conflict, sorry. However, despite his attempts, he was unable to favor the involvement of fighters from that network into Algeria, and that's quite interesting. Okay, so what do I do in the paper, or what I want to do in the paper is I want to look at a set of explanations for this. And when I mean a set of explanation, I mean a sort of broad categories of factors that could or could not contribute. And at the moment I have them defined in sort of 5 categories. And what I would like to do in the paper, to be honest, I've not written it yet. I've got some of the sections have been written, some not. Would be to look at each of these and see whether it tells me something about this Algerian case. So I'm gonna go through each of them. I think it's 5, and give you sort of where I am now, and I'd be very happy to take feedback on this. And you will see some of them are slightly more developed, some of them are mostly because I've researched them before in other contexts, and some others are a bit less. But they're all at some level present in the work of scholars that looked either at civil wars or specifically at the MENA region. I'm checking the time here. Okay, good.
Sorry, Francesco. No, you're good.
No. Just as checking the time for my own timing. Okay, my 5 areas, if you want, my 5 broad categories of explanation. The first one would be sub-regional dynamics. So dynamics that play in the Maghreb region that would explain or not explain lack of external involvement. What do I mean by this sort of first category? I mean, all that would fall within regional dynamics. So for example, the idea that the Maghreb region by the early 90s was relatively less conflict-ridden. And what was, I use Aaron's definition there, but obviously you might look at the English school as well. The system was homogeneous, and I think Aaron defines an homogeneous system as one where, while there is competition, the main actors recognize each other as legitimate actors and have some sort of understanding of the key norms of the system. So there is competition, but it's somehow limited and narrowed. In particular, Moroccan-Algerian rivalry, which had been a feature of the sub-region of the Maghreb, although still present, was less acute. Other actors, Libya as a obvious example, which had been a spoiler in previous phases, were embroiled in different foreign policy issues. In the case of Libya, under sanction, on and off involved in the Chadian civil war, plus an overall decline of military effectiveness by different states, and militaries already, as Korsman discusses, were not necessarily the most effective. On top of that, you could have regional actors that were more concerned by threats posed by Islamists, so not really looking to take advantage of that. So this is the first block of explanations, if you want. And again, when I look at these 5, as I will mention in the conclusion, I'm not looking at them as sort of alternative explanations, rather at different levels, which I try to make sense of how they operate as I look more into this case. The second one, and I'm gonna quote Chris in this because I think he discussed this very well in reference of the case of Syria, is the idea of sort of world system, whether it's unipolar, bipolar, or multipolar, and the time frame and geopolitical conditions that relate to this. So obviously the Algerian civil war took place in a very specific time frame. When we look at how we divide the sort of perception of the timeline of external influence in the MENA region. First of all, you could argue that superpowers competition was less crucial to the Maghreb, less central in the Maghreb than it was in the Levant and the Gulf. But even taking that into account, we are there in a phase of end of the Cold War and American moment. So what does it mean in terms of lack of external involvement? In other words, is there something specific about this American era that shapes a lack of external involvement? Would that be different if we were in full Cold War or if we were in a post-Iraq moment? I'm not sure about this, and I think this needs to be discussed in reference to the different dynamics that characterize the Maghreb region, relations with France as an external power, more than anything else. So this would be, and obviously 1 and 2 should speak to each other. They don't at the moment, but I think they're closely related. Then there's another set of factors which I find very interesting, and there is obviously a very strong presence in the literature of these emphasis on civil wars and sectarian ethnic cleavages, which colleagues that worked on sectarianism have discussed very well. and obviously has been revisited with the Syrian conflict. Now, Algeria, it's very interesting there for a set of reasons. First of all, it did not present sectarian cleavages. Obviously, you have a secular regime, but one that traditionally has played with religion, versus an Islamist opposition. I mean, this is not really a sectarian cleavage, it is a sort of secular versus religious one. And what I find very interesting about Algerian is the lack of a Berber dimension. Obviously, Algeria's got a very populous Berber, very big Berber population that traditionally had difficult relations with the state, including a Berber Spring, a Berber peaceful uprising, if you want, a few years earlier. However, the Berber population at large did not get involved or support the uprising and the start of the civil war, with significant regional and local variations, though. So there wasn't a sort of unique position by different Berber tribes and clans in regards to the civil war, which I think sort of shielded the conflict from this particular factor in a way. Now, I find the idea of sectarian cleavages or lack of very, very interesting and a good contribution to this particular paper because of the relation between state and non-state actors. So, for example, and I've discussed this a bit in something as I wrote in the past, the idea of how state actors use sectarianism for the purpose of recruiting, training, and using, if you want, non-state actors, foreign fighters. And I think it's obviously there is a lot of literature on that which needs to be addressed. Final one, and this is where I am at the moment, so this is probably not as well developed as it should be. There are two aspects, and I think they mirror each other. One is, and it's present in the literature in Algeria, is the emphasis on Algerian uniqueness and political culture that sort of cherishes separation and rejects external influence. And then I would say the question is, how unique is this uniqueness? Because you find that obviously in the literature and in the political culture of several countries. One thing that makes me think that there might be something there is the fact that you find a lot of emphasis in the literature on Algeria on this idea of an Algerian Islamist movement which was separated somehow from transnational movements. I think a good example there is the Hamas movement, which from the 1990s at least was the main branch, the main representative of the Muslim Brotherhood in Algeria, which was at a higher degree of independence if you compare it with the Muslim Brotherhood branches in other countries of the Maghreb. So perhaps there's something there. Also, and this is quite, this emerges quite clearly in the work of some people that have engaged with, from the point of view of terrorist studies and have collected or analyzed the narrative from the point of view of jihadists. There is the idea that perhaps Algeria had a sort of lower symbolic relevance compared, for example, to other civil wars. And there is some reference, and I've not found the direct reference, but there is someone that quotes Bin Laden himself, referring to the fact that the Algerian Islamists were somehow savages, and they were not really Islamists. It was more like a simple criminality, and I guess this could make sense if you think about the turn that the Algerian civil war took towards the final years when the Jia divided and splintered into different groups. Okay, so basically what I'm doing here is I'm looking at this set of factors and trying to understand whether they say something about the Algerian civil war or not. What I would like to do later on is per each of them use do some sort of comparison with other cases from the MENA region. But I have to say, in a way, I found the same problem that Chris mentioned, the one of struggling with finding good comparisons, because each case seems to be so unique that it does bring some problems when you try to compare them and use a comparative approach. All right, concluding. I've looked at broad set of factors, but obviously one of the challenges is that I could look at others, and these would become maybe not an academic article, but something much longer. Now, the categories and factors that listed here, although they're not very clear in my mind yet, I'm sure that they are they operate at different levels and affect different actors. So I'm not looking here for a single explanation of why the Algerian civil war saw a different level, so a low level of external involvement. I'm rather kind of thinking how I can conceptualize that and the relationship between different levels and different actors. Maybe one way of looking at that, it's the completely opposite one. So a much larger number of cases, and then thinking about how methodologically how I could address that. As you can see, this is very much work in progress. So I look forward to your comments. I have to say, I'm not an Algeria expert. So one of the reasons why I decided to do this paper, write this paper, is because several colleagues, including some that I've seen in the list of participants, have told me, well, look at the Algerian case more specifically. It would tell you a lot because it is the odd one out. I'm doing that now, so any feedback, any help on that would be much welcome. Thank you very much.
That was brilliant, Francesco. Thank you so much.
How many minutes was it, Olivia? Was I good with time or?
Yeah, 20. Perfect.
Perfect.
excluding your organizer remarks. So I hope that you are going to write this paper, or the book for that matter.
Yeah, well, yeah. So the book may be in the future, but the paper, yeah, it's coming sometimes in the future.
So inshallah, it will be soon. Great. Then, as Francesco mentioned, I also encourage you to place your questions in the question and answer box, and as very many already have done, name the speaker the question is addressed to, and as told beforehand, try to keep it as concise and clear as possible. So I would say let's move back to Maria. We have here a question by Jakob Eriksson, and he thanks you, Maria, for a great presentation. And he says that he knows that it's early days, but do you think Kharimi's raid on KH suggests anything about the broader issue of security sector reform and his appetite to bring the Hajj under greater government control?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I would like to say that I would like to hear Jacob's assessment of this question as well, if he's allowed to speak. But yes, it's very early days, and I think, as Jacob also knows, it's a very complicated issue. And one thing is intentions, another thing is what is actually possible in the context of Iraqi and regional and international politics. So certainly there's been a sort of a rhetorical underlining of the need for the Hostel Shabi and specifically some of these sort of Iranian very influential groups to accept the authority of the Prime Minister. And obviously he also has, because of his background in the intelligence services, he has a network in the security forces that might help him here. I think that there was also, because of the events during the protests, I think that there is a small window of opportunity, because there has been a decline in public support for some of these groups in Iraq. But then, on the other hand, Iran remains the most influential external actor in Iraq. Will he get the support that he needs from other actors? And here, by support, I also mean that the US, for example, Trump, does not do something that would allow these groups to regain a greater deal of support within Iraq. I also think that we have to recognize that these militias are supported by a strong network of politicians who are also linked to Iran and So that might also pose some difficulties for him. And then there's also, as part of this discussion, I think some of these groups seems to be acting more as spoilers than actually having a sort of strategic agenda. Or you could argue that their agenda is to spoil the potential for reform because they would prefer a status quo situation. So these attacks by Kataja Paspola and some of the other groups on US interests in Iraq can be seen as attempts to ignite a response from the US, which would most likely lead to a backlash. But yeah, if Eric has the opportunity to give me his answer, I'll be very interested in hearing his evaluation of the potential for Kadimi to regain control over the security forces. Thanks.
Thank you, Maria. Yeah, if they have time, I think we can consider maybe if he would like to jump in. Let's move on to Chris now. We have a question from Yasmin Ghani, and the questions keep moving. Pardon. So Yasmin says, great paper so far. Many things, and she enjoyed your paper, Chris. She enjoyed it a lot, in fact, and she says the systemic context is a very important one, and she does agree. You nuance this by mentioning domestic constraints that might have an impact on reconciliation. This could be broken down further. For example, what is the role of personalities? We do have two historical examples of rapprochement between Syria and the US in the 1970s, and especially early 1990s. There are a couple of chapters in her book as well about this. So in 1990 to 1991, unipolarity, bracket system factors, had an impact, but so did the personal role of Secretary of State James Baker, willing to put the shuttle diplomacy in. So who would be the important US personality in the current case, especially with Trump in charge? And she says, thank you very much.
It's a great question, Jasmine. Thank you. I was going to say before you put it in your comment that, you know, actually on the Syria case, your book is brilliant for examples of this. Yes, of course, you know, personality is very important. And what really struck me about looking at the four cases that I focused on, you know, the breakthroughs did come often when there were particular personalities involved, and what really is interesting is that it can work in different ways. So you know, on the one hand, with, you know, the Spain case, there was it was a really slow build-up of you know, gradual US re-engagement with the Franco regime, but early on it was those kind of like early Cold Warriors like Marshall, like Dean Ashes, and people like that who were really putting pressure on President Truman, to the point where actually President Truman was the only person in the White House administration that still opposed Franco by the end of his term in office. So, you know, personalities did matter, but even then they weren't really sort of like, you know, doing the shuttle diplomacy you're talking about. In the Spanish case, what's more interesting is that a lot of the engagement early on came from the bottom up. A lot of it came from business contacts, especially the tourist industry. So there's a huge amount of American tour companies wanting to basically send tourists over to Spain, and actually that engagement really played a role in sort of then lobbying upwards towards the US government to improve its stamp. So in those cases, you know, you can get those slow burners. In the case of Vietnam, is very similar to what you're talking about with Syria in the 1990s. You know, it was a few individuals, especially John Kerry and John McCain, who were really sort of pushing for this re-engagement with Vietnam. Though interestingly, it was again commercial interests rather than necessarily geopolitical interests that were really driving that. It was that desire to engage economically with Vietnam that really kind of, you know, push things there. So, you know, in that sense, I think you do need that, you know, the structural, as you said in your question, the structural shifts do need to happen to allow space for the personalities to actually, you know, then step into, which I suppose, you know, finishing, you know, returning to your question about now, that makes it even more unlikely that under Trump, which hopefully will only be a few more months, there will be, you know, there will be an engagement from the Trump administration, because this administration has only space for one personality. And there has been a very conscious effort by Trump to weed out anyone that, you know, might go, you know, might challenge his own particular way of governing. And you know, you've seen that over the course of the administration. I think that I mean, I for one don't think for a moment there'll be any chance of any kind of engagement with the Assad regime for numerous reasons. Whilst Trump is in power, at least up to sort of, you know, the election this year. I suppose if he's re-elected, there might be a shift. But I think what will be more interesting is if Biden wins, and if, you know, because I think if Biden governs in the way that, say, Obama governed, or, you know, Clinton governed, there will be space for those personalities to take the initiative. So if circumstances change, if the, you know, geopolitical system makes it more preferable for the US to engage with Syria, and if, I go back to my earlier point, that domestic lobby shifts, which I could only really see if the situation in Iran considerably changes, but, you know, I might be wrong. Then there might be space for, yeah, the sort of James Baker of the day to, you know, bring Syria in if they can. The difference is, I mean, I will say one of the big issues, of course, with Syria now compared to Syria in the past is the level of bloodshed as well that's taken place. You know, you know, the regime of Hafez al-Assad obviously butchered, you know, up to 40,000 people in Hama in 1982. But the publicity that received during the Cold War was relatively limited, so it was less controversial for the US to have a rapprochement with the Hafez al-Assad regime when it needed to in the early 90s. I think that something pretty big has got to change for the American public to not accuse an engaging American administration with the Assad regime of complete hypocrisy if it suddenly does a U-turn, having made a very big deal about, you know, the level of slaughter in the Syrian civil war and the human rights violations.
Super, thank you, Chris. Splendid. Would you like to stay on? So then I would like
Always.
I would like to ask you, actually, Chris, would you mind verbally putting your question to Francesco?
Sorry, I privately messaged Olivia and said, I've got a question for Francesco. So
no, sorry, I want to written down like everybody else.
Exactly.
No,
I didn't have time to type whilst I was listening to everyone else. So I suppose I really, at first, Francesco, I didn't get the chance to say I complimented Maria-Louise's fantastic paper, but your paper was also absolutely brilliant and really interesting. And the Algerian case is really fascinating. And I've read your paper you've written before on it. But I suppose two factors don't seem to come into your analysis that I just wonder where they would fit in. One is geography, which is, you know, you talk about the symbolism of Algeria as being less symbolic than Syria, but what about the geographical location as well, which is that, you know, it's difficult to get to Algeria. You know, it is really easy to get to Syria if you're sort of like, you know, an international freedom fighter / jihadist or whatever. You know, you can go through Turkey, you can go through Iraq if you're sort of, you know, a Kurdish nationalist, you can come through Lebanon. You know, it is a much more accessible country than Algeria, especially given that the Moroccan border was closed throughout, you know, all that time. So it's very difficult. You know, you've either got to cross the desert or you've got to sort of go through Tunisia. It's a way more difficult place to go. So geography is important. Also, you talk about international structures, but I also wonder about technology as a factor which is, the often famed Al Jazeera effect. Syria, as I just mentioned, was all over the news, right, across the world, and of course the Arab world as well, and it outraged people, what was going on, because of, you have 24-hour news coverage of, the atrocities. It's in Twitter, it's not, it's there. That didn't exist in the 1990s when the Algerian civil war was really in its height. I mean, it was coming on board in the early 2000s when the war was concluded, but that makes it way more possible for this to be isolating. It is geographically isolated, but it's also almost kind of publicly a more isolated conflict. So I just wonder how, when you're looking at those comparisons, how those factors of those changing factors of geography and technology come into play in your analysis.
Can I take it now, Olivia, or you want to add some other questions?
No, please go ahead.
All right, so they're very, very good points, Chris. So I'll start with the second one. I mean, the sort of media and Al Jazeera effect. I think you have a point there, but also there are civil wars that took place before the Algerian one that seem to have higher involvement of external actors. So maybe if you look at Algeria and Syria, and this is one of the things that I do argue in the comparison between Algeria and Syria, certainly maybe then this is sort of, media and as you say, it was all over, but then again, I think it sort of connects to your other point of geography, because maybe it's all over the news because it's symbolically relevant. Maybe there's something that makes it go all over the news, and I think there might be something in this idea of geography, which is a physical one, as you said, it's harder to reach, and then maybe we might sort of separate between fighters coming from different parts of the world, right? It might be very hard for some, not so difficult for some others. But I think it's not only geographical, it's also I think there's something about the symbolic aspect of it, about the sort of wilderness of the Algerian civil war, that I think, from my reading, it also has to do with the way that the Algerian civil war developed. Because at the beginning, particularly when you talk about non-state actors, some of these Algerian fighters, Algerian Afghans that had fought in Afghanistan, they had pedigree, as one would say, in terms of fights. They were well respected in Afghanistan, and that for some reason they're either unable or unwilling to use these networks. Later on, I think this has to do with the sort of trajectory of the Algerian civil war that makes it less part of the narrative, and maybe more easily painted as a sort of violent, non-ideological, more sort of small criminality component to it. But yeah, I do take your point. On the one of geography, I try to look at it in the two aspects, in the regional and in the geographical. And one of the things that I mentioned, that I discuss in the regional, is this idea of the Moroccan border. Seems very important, because in previous phases, in previous decades, as I would understand, that border had been a source of trouble, and by the 90s, Algeria and Morocco had found some sort of uneasy understanding, if not best of friends, they at least as some sort of basic understanding. Does that answer it? So it fits within the regional, I would say. At least I try to discuss it within the regional. I think your microphone is off. Yeah. Go ahead.
Can I just ask just a quick follow-up, just a thought that's just interesting as you were talking about then, in terms of your symbolic point.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite interesting just because, of course, during the 50s, the Algerian War of Independence against the French was kind of the big cause célèbre in the Arab world. It really was symbolically very important.
Yeah.
Nasser talked about it. In Syria they talked about it. In Lebanon they talked about it. It was really, and yet when it effectively disintegrates as a state in the 90s, those voices aren't there. So I wonder why. I wonder why it's sort of not getting the attention that it wants to.
I think though this also plays the other way around, because probably the Algerian regime still has some sort of reputation, if you want, that comes from that kind of particular struggle that's more recent than other regimes, and perhaps it benefits more. Would that make sense? Like maybe it's just actually it benefits from that, and the narrative that sticks in other places doesn't. I think though that, and this is not necessarily sort of Middle East based. I think when I refer to like sort of bipolar versus unipolar versus multipolar, which obviously it's also in your paper, I think also there is a sort of added bonus that comes with being able to fight against a superpower. So for example, and this is not necessarily only regional, right? Think about Afghanistan, for example. How much attention comes from, how much importance comes from the idea of you can actually fight the USSR. Maybe when there isn't, and that's why I think the interaction between state and non-state actors is interesting both ways, in terms of the way that state actors use foreign fighters, but also the other way around. So, I mean, I have not really figured it out how I want to conceptualize it, but certainly there is something there. They're excellent comments, and maybe I'll ask you a bit more later on. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Thanks. They're excellent comments, Chris.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. We should.
Sorry, I didn't want to monopolize it and take advantage of that to like write my paper with Chris now.
I think this is also to the benefit of the. Yeah. Now this is also to the benefit of the participants, right? To have a bit of a lovely discussion. However, I also now would like to bring in Maria-Louise, and then we can continue. Maria, we had one more for you here from Sayed Tahsin Raza, and he says, if I may ask, where Iraq finds itself in terms of its stand in relation to the recent implementation of Trump's peace plan for Israel-Palestine, which is going to decisively affect all the Middle Eastern countries.
Yeah, I will start out by saying that I'm not an expert on the Israel-Palestine conflict, but I think here again, it's kind of a similar answer in a way, because I think the Kadhimi, the Iraqi prime minister, has tried to strike a balance where he between not wanting to make enemies or getting into trouble because of this situation is so important. So on the one side, he has the US. He doesn't want to antagonize the US or Trump by being very outspoken on the Israel-Palestine. But on the other hand, he has internal actors such as Qatar, Hezbollah, for example, and others who are very openly critical. So I think he is trying to find a balance and avoid being pushed into taking a strong position that could potentially antagonize any party and make enemies. So really trying to keep a low profile on this issue. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And then let's move back to Chris. Chris, we have one for you from Salam Al-Sadi. And he says, it seems from the results that regardless of the type of the international system, bipolar versus multipolar, what matters really is whether or not the winner is perceived as a potential ally. Is that a fair assessment?
So thanks, Salam. That's a really interesting question. I'm not sure that fully it fully follows like that, in that in the instances where the US did engage. So the two examples I talked about, which was Spain and Vietnam, certainly the Spain case, yes, absolutely. Spain was seen as a potential ally vis-a-vis the Soviet Union in regards to the Cold War, and of course, what was happening in Spain, what the US was doing with the Spanish is something the US had effectively done with West Germany at the end of the First World War, and Japan, like effectively flipped an existing enemy state into an ally state, and turned them around and faced them towards the Soviet Union. So the fact that Spain had been allied with the Axis during the Second World War, to all intents and purposes, it was that kind of potential ally in the same context that you've seen with other former Axis powers. But that's not the case with Vietnam. So with Vietnam, you know, like I was just saying, my answer to Jasmine, you know, the interests were primarily commercial rather than geopolitical. So it was a market, I think, rather than a geopolitical ally. And of course, you know, the regime in Vietnam had not changed. This was still, you know, the communist regime that the US had been fighting, you know, throughout the second half of the 1950s and all the 1960s and early 1970s. You know, they weren't a potential ally in that sense. So, you know, that wasn't the driver, at least not from what I could see. And then I suppose the flip side of that is Saddam Hussein. You know, Saddam Hussein was an ally, really, of the United States in the 1980s. They strongly supported Saddam's war against a revolutionary Iran, supplied weapons and so on, and effectively endorsed the invasion and so on. It was only in the 1990s that he turned into sort of, you know, this enemy. So there wasn't sort of necessarily this, you know, impossibility of Saddam ever being an ally in that sense. So I don't think, from what I can gather, there is this sort of, you know, rigid. I don't think what is happening from the US perspective is this sort of completely blunt assessment of these pariah states, whereby they're saying, you know, okay, can we work with these guys or not? Can we flip them one way or the other? I think sometimes that does happen, but what I was trying to explain in my presentation is that there are these other variables coming into play that are affecting the decision-making process. You know, the international context does matter, but that domestic factor does matter. I think in many ways that, you know, the perception of them being a potential ally is something that is a very, if it, you know, obviously you're not going to you're not going to engage with a state that you're still actively seeing as an enemy. You have to start watering down that notion first of all. You have to start breaking it down. But sometimes there can be relatively swift shifts in how the United States indeed engages with a state, even with a state previously perceived as an enemy. The classic example is Nixon to China, whereby very quickly there's a shift. It's not about seeing China as an ally, it's seeing them as sort of a counterbalance against the Soviet Union. So it's quite a long-winded way of saying, no, I don't think it's just this fixed perception of can they be a friend or not. There are these other factors coming into play, although obviously those perceptions do change over time.
Splendid, thank you very much, Chris. Very excellent. And then we also have one that's actually directed to all of you. It is from our very own Simon Maybaum. He says, thanks everyone, really interesting papers. And one of the themes that has featured across this event has been the future of multipolarity in a possible post-US region. How might this affect the various aspects of regional politics discussed across the panel? So I would like to ask each of you to have a go, and I'd go back to Maria first.
Okay. Well, obviously the whole background for some of these discussions in Iraq is the declining role of the US and the limited interest also by the US in defining Iraqi politics. And they've clearly demonstrated that they do not want to commit to any type of intervention that would bring them into Iraq on the scale that they have been previously. At the same time, Trump's policies towards Iran has the ability to undermine reform initiatives or politicians or actors in Iraq that are seeking their own agendas. So he has become more of a spoiler sometimes than facilitating actually necessarily actors that would seek possibly to limit the influence of Iran, for example. We have not spoken about it, but obviously there are also other actors, Turkey being one that has also increased its influence and interests, China, Russia. So I think what we're seeing here is generally that the US and Iran remains the two key actors in Iraq, but that there's a certain vacuum, or there's a certain space now where a number of actors are trying to build their influence and ability to influence Iraqi politics. And it's also in light of this that you see protesters and actors, including the prime minister, sort of underlining Iraqi sovereignty, nationalism, the need for external actors to stay out of Iraqi affairs and sort of reassert Iraqi sovereignty, but also struggling to do so because the other part of it is that Iraq is so dependent on external actors, and I think with the current economic difficulties, and I think here talking about politics is obviously important, but and a very important background to this is to realize that the economy in Iraq is heavily challenged, and which makes it really difficult to actually carry out any of the reforms or to disengage from external backers. So I think it will be very interesting because it might also be that the declining role of the US, if that is also followed by a pushback against Iranian influence, could see greater involvement of a wider variety of regional actors, which could potentially lead to a situation where Iraqi politicians, actors would be able to play out actors against each other, which could potentially give them a little bit more leeway. But I think it's very difficult to say at present how this will play out in the Iraqi context. And a lot of it, I think, also depends on what the US does still, because this maximum pressure strategy against Iran trumps unpredictability, certainly has the potential to impact Iraq, as we have seen. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you very much. Francesco, would you like to give it a go?
I'll try, Olivia. So just going back to try to connect it to my papers, what I'm working on to this particular presentation. Obviously, I'm not a specialist in the Maghreb and Algeria, and as I read and try to understand a bit more this particular country and the Maghreb more generally, it seemed to me that the effect and the centrality of sort of US role and predominance in the region were certainly not a parameter or a factor that is emphasized by scholars of the Maghreb as much as they are in, for example, the Levant and the slightly more familiar with. So my sense is that it probably will affect transition towards a multipolar world will affect regions and sub-regions quite differently according to the level of engagement of the US before, and therefore how much these regions or sub-regions could be places where actually this competition is played, because it probably, when we talk about a multipolar world, I guess part of what we are thinking is how this transition goes, right? Is that do we see the US declining? Do we see other powers coming in? And obviously, if you think about, I don't know, Israel-Palestine, then the presence of the US there, because of its relations with Israel, because of historical reasons, is so strong that it's clear that any reshaping on American foreign policy has direct effects there. But in other parts of the MENA region, and that's again, it's my understanding as a newbie in these, in the Maghreb in particular, it's just not as central. So perhaps it will be less. Perhaps it would have different effects according to the role played by the US so far, I would say.
Thanks, Francesco. Chris, what about you?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Simon, and it does tie in quite nicely with my presentation, because I suppose that the question should be, for, why should Syria care that the US is trying to isolate it if we're now moving into this post-US Middle East in a way that, it's interesting that, though I made a comparison with sort of the sanctions on the Saddam regime, it's interesting. It's perhaps a sign of the decline of US global and regional power, that it hasn't been able to create a UN sanctions regime on Syria in the way it did on Iraq. That said, the curveball into that are the Caesar sanctions that have just been announced, and it is in many ways a last gasp attempt by the US to use its financial power, because that's effectively what it is, of which it is still clearly the world leader, and the use of the dollar in particular as a means to punish and isolate the Syrian regime. And what will be a really interesting kind of test case as to whether or not we are actually in this post-US Middle East is whether global and regional powers actually respect a US request to isolate Assad. Now, obviously, Russia and Iran won't, but going back to the panel that I was chairing earlier today, India's response will be very interesting. China's response will be very interesting, and indeed, what we've seen in the last couple of days is a challenge coming from the UAE. The UAE actually really wants to re-engage Assad, and and its main form of leverage there is economic and investing inside post-war Syria, because it sees Assad as a pillar in its anti-Muslim Brotherhood, anti-Turkey, anti-Qatar regional politics. And you've recently seen Syria back the government of Haftar in eastern Libya, as part of that. So whether or not the UAE, a US ally, defies the US on the Caesar sanctions will be really interesting, a really good indication of whether or not we are moving to a genuinely post-US Middle East, or if they fall back in line, it might suggest, well, actually, they do still have a degree of power and influence as the biggest kid on the block, if not necessarily the only show in town anymore.
Excellent, Chris. Thank you. I have one question for Maria, but then we also have one that is going back to all of you. I will start with the one for Maria, if that's okay with you. It is by our Iyad Al-Rifai, and Maria, he asks you, how does the Iranian influence continue, or how does Iran continue to influence with the same ideational tools towards, let's say, the new generations in Iraq and Lebanon?
So as I'm understanding the question, it goes into how, I mean, Iran is referred to generally, also relating to some of the other presentations, as a state that has been quite successful in influencing and building a network of proxies, if you will, or groups that share its ideational goals. And as we have seen in Iraq and Lebanon during these protests that began last year, you've seen young people kind of reject this at least sectarian understanding of political systems and the constitutional system in Lebanon, the Muhassasa in Iraq, and putting forth nationalism as an alternative. Obviously, this has the potential to challenge Iran's influence in these countries, and I think work has been done that shows that Iran is most successful in its relationships when there's both but not necessarily a shared sort of religious understanding, shared regional goals, and a shared internal agenda. And I think here you can see that the Iran is experiencing being challenged on these. I think one of the things here, and that's coming back to the previous questions about the U.S. role, that what we have seen is also that one of the things that can provide a backlash or can reestablish at least some support, or at least quiet down the most critical voices against Iran, is if the U.S. does something, because the U.S. is still worse than Iran. But I do think that Iran is struggling a little bit, also because Iran, as we both all know, also is itself struggling with harsh economic circumstances, which also weakens its ability to actually be an attractive partner for a number of groups. Again, and I think this also goes for a number of situations, if Iran is the only potential backer that you have, of course, it has more leeway. So I think that would also be sort of a policy advice, that we also need to think about that, that sometimes refusing to engage with actors pushes them towards Iran or others that we don't like as much. But I think it will be interesting to see with the developments we are seeing right now, both sort of international on a global scale and regionally, how Iran will adapt. Because I do feel like, Ayad knows that I also work on Yemen, I do feel like Iran has benefited a lot from the mistakes of others. So let's see if that continues, or if perhaps other actors are starting to pick up the pace of it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Maria. I have been nodding in agreement with your last sentence, actually, your last comment. So the last question that is actually directed to all three of you is quite long. I'll read it to you. It is from Fatima Ali Khalud, and she says, Lebanon had a multifaceted civil war lasting for decades, and today it is facing a lack of political instability / inability. After the Taif Agreement, Lebanon was considered an example of cross-sectarian coexistence, albeit very fragile, that is always tipping the country into an imminent civil war. And she says that she believes that this cross-sectarian coexistence is always exploited by regional and international foes. And she would like to know, in your opinion, how do you perceive the possibility of Lebanon verging into another conflict, igniting new rounds of greater violence, given its current social, political, and economic situation? And with Israel one step away from Netanyahu's announcement regarding the West Bank annexation, do you think this scenario might corroborate to trigger a more amplified war between Israel and Lebanon? Do you believe that Syria will engage directly in the next war? I would like to open it to the floor, so please jump in. Yes, please, Chris. Thank you. Go ahead.
So I never wanting to be, someone who predicts the future or not. But even so, I think to all three of those questions that Fatima's put, I would stick my neck on the line and say I would probably expect no to all three. The reason being the structural conditions for conflict aren't there. So with regard to Lebanon, verging to another civil conflict, actually it's quite interesting talking about, Francesco's paper. There's a lot of overlap there. There's a very strong war weariness in Lebanon, full stop. The fact that they, that I think it just at an individual level has deterred conflict, like serious return to civil war in Lebanon for a long time. In the same way that you get civil war fatigue in places like Algeria, even though there's a lot of public unrest in Algeria at the moment, the prospect of conflict seems to be quite low. But also within Lebanon, you have quite a strong structural incentive against conflict. The main reason being that there are only really two institutions in Lebanon that would be waging conflict. They are Hezbollah and the Lebanese army. and at this moment in time, they are effectively allies. They both have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. The curveball is the protest movement that's emerged, which in many ways is challenging the status quo and challenging both of those groups. But they very consciously sought to remain peaceful, again, because of the civil war fatigue. So, whilst they might clash with those, entities that are preserving the status quo in terms of Hezbollah and the army, the military, and the prospect of the opposition taking up arms is relatively limited. And so the only chance of, I think, sort of some kind of civil conflict re-emerging in Lebanon is if those two entities, Hezbollah and the army, turn on one another. And at the moment, I think that seems very, very unlikely. So, I mean, I think that domestic factor is quite low. The idea of an Israel-Hezbollah conflict is something that obviously the Israelis talk about a lot. But there is also, again, a structural disincentive there, which is the balance of terror between both sides. The 2006 war was so devastating to both actors that actually, and both have rearmed themselves even more. I think that launching something on a similar scale to 2006 seems quite unlikely, although both sides like to play up the possibility in order to get their own domestic constituents on side. Again, might be wrong on that, but I get the impression that I was actually up in northern Israel in January of this year, and I was talking to various security chiefs about this, and they quietly don't expect a conflict. And people I've spoken to on the Hezbollah side, likewise, think there's going to be an ongoing tit for tat in over the border in Syria, but that with a conscious effort not to escalate. And then the final point about whether Syria would engage directly in a Lebanese war, not for the foreseeable future. They are completely exhausted from their own war, which is still going on. The idea that they would jump into Lebanon is highly unlikely. The only circumstance in which they might would be is if Hezbollah's position was so precarious that Iran and its allies try to send the Syrians in to support them in some way. But again, as I mentioned in my first answer, that seems unlikely at the moment. So that's my kind of rough crystal ball gazing with the usual caveats. But I would say that the structural tensions aren't in place at the moment for the scenario that you're describing there.
Great, love the crystal ball gazing. Yeah, Francesco's already ready. Go.
So I agree with Chris. The only thing I would add would be on the point of, I'm sorry, I'm rereading the question, on the point of Israel and possible tensions related to one Israeli domestic politics. They usually are probably managed within like not massive confrontations, but like smaller scale shows of forts for domestic audiences. And related to that, the idea of the West Bank annexation project, no, I don't think it's going to result in a all-out war. In fact, and when it is announced, because we have heard in the last weeks, the last days, there might actually be some problems with that. Probably the immediate afterwards of that might be quite anticlimactic in many ways. Not much would change probably immediately. I'm talking about West Bank annexation afterwards. I don't think that would trigger a conflict. Also because Hezbollah itself is obviously just de-escalating from the Syrian conflict. So and whether Syria will engage. No, I would just on the last point, I would just second what Chris said. Not at the moment, but yeah, I would say I absolutely agree with Chris. The only thing that I would add, it's perhaps another reason of concern and something that might slightly change the predictions is Israeli domestic politics and Netanyahu's own struggle for survival, and with tensions with guns already emerging. That might be a further reason of instability, which I think reasonably will be contained within the usual sort of rhetoric, but there might be something that spills over. And that's me for this question.
Thank you. Maria, this is not exactly your core area, but if there's anything you would like to add, please do.
No, I think I will. I agree very much with what is being said, but as you also say, it's not my core area. Yeah, so.
Super. Thank you very much. Then what remains for me to say is a huge thanks to all of our panelists. It has been a fantastic panel, a very splendid one. Thank you to all participants. Thanks to all questions that you have asked. So thank you, and I applaud you all. It was a fantastic 3 days, very, very inspiring.